Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing so far? Things are good? Great. Great to have this energy in the room today. So, as he said, this is me. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. If you have any questions around any of those different topics that he mentioned or that are listed here, be more than happy to discuss them with you after, during our Q&A session, during the break in between, or during lunch. So I'll be around. So we're here today to talk about breaking down silos with human-centric multidisciplinary approaches. And Chris Corrigan, facilitator and process artist, said, everyone knows that systems atrophy when they divide their work into silos. Silos entrench difference and prevent learning across sectors, whether we're talking about departments or within an organization. How many of you have dedicated security teams currently in your organization? A few of you. And so for those of you that have dedicated security teams, how many of you feel that your security team is approachable? Okay. Do you feel that your security team perhaps is in like an ivory tower, or is defensive, or is aggressive? They are apart from yourselves. I see a couple of heads nodding, so. All right. So in talking about that, how many of you also have compliance teams? Oh, I see one, two compliance teams. So where is that compliance team located? So for you that have compliance team, what department are they in?
Compliance department.
Compliance department? So they report into any other part of the organization?
They report into actually the CFO.
Okay, great. So finance. Any other?
I
Yeah.
usually go to legal with compliance measures.
So do you feel that that compliance function operates in a silo? That's okay. That's fair. So what? It's fine. So what is compliance? Let's just level set ourselves here a little bit. What definition we're utilizing for compliance today? Compliance is adhering to a set of best practices, rules, contractual requirements, regulations, and legislation. Traditionally, capital C compliance has lived in the silos of legal or finance, separated from the security or engineering teams. And often, inflexible policies are written to address the requirements of compliance frameworks without considering a practical security posture or technical implementation. For anybody that's worked in a large organization, reading somebody's information security policies after they've gone through the ISO 27000 series, it could be a little bit painful, and they're not very approachable, and they're pretty much not useful. And so, essentially what happens is this leads to the circumvention of policies and controls in order to get the work done, or frustration by employees who develop a view of compliance as irrational red tape. So embedding a technical compliance team with both policy and security experience within the security department to act as translators and facilitators fosters an understanding between technical teams and the legal department. It helps develop flexible policies and controls which address the spirit of compliance requirements, and it makes all parties, from the technical staff to the legal staff to the auditors, comfortable with asking and processing the question, what problem are we trying to solve? So now we're going to go into an activity here. We're going to pair off, and if you're in the same company, sometimes this is okay because you all may not know what problems each other are trying to solve. But I'd like you to take 2 minutes, each of you, to describe to the person next to you, what problems does your team solve? So let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and start. And then I'll say time, and then you switch, okay? Go ahead and start. All right, thank you all for participating. Remember some of the answers that you received from each other, and also remember how you approached this when you were talking with each other, because we're going to revisit this a little bit later. So how have we done this at Duo? How have we built effective compliance and security teams? Well, we've done it through a multidisciplinary approach that is focused on more than just the people, process, and product, and the underlying infrastructure and technology. So when we talk about multidisciplinary, what do we mean here? when we say multidisciplinary. We're talking about a team that is built up of multiple academic disciplines. They're redefining the problems outside of normal boundaries. They reach new solutions through a new understanding of complex situations. It's more than just checking the box. We pair a multidisciplinary team with a human-centric way of working. Our teams are seeking to understand deeply held needs and motivations that explains why our customers, internal and external, behave the way that they do. For those working in compliance and in security, we should be asking ourselves daily, are we operating with integrity, empathy, and simplicity? Are we making these policies or controls overly complicated? How do we get to the spirit of the requirement and strike a balance between keeping it simple and maturing the security posture of the company? Are we just taking the easy way out in our interpretation of the requirements? I mean, this happens. We can just say, all right, we're checking the box. We know that our customers have said, you need to be PCI compliant, or you need to have a SOC 2. Type 1 or type 2? Well, let's just do a type 1 because it's point in time. Sure, we can do that. But ultimately, we need to not just be settling to check a box. We need to be mindful of what we're asking our stakeholders within the organization during audits, risk assessments, and security control reviews. So this is how we're doing it at Duo. We take that people process product and we integrate it with integrity, empathy, and simplicity in all that we do, both from the policy perspective and from the control perspective. When we expand our focus from people, process, and product to include integrity, empathy, and simplicity, we build trust and we build respect with our internal stakeholders and our customers. The other piece here, when we're thinking about multidisciplinary teams, is diversity by design. And so just let me give you my example and my path to information security. So how did I develop this perspective of a multidisciplinary, human-centric approach? Well, as mentioned in my bio, I was a music major. I started out as a vocal performance major, and reading music and being part of an ensemble teaches you about thinking about what comes next. Always being able to keep that in frame while you are executing in the present, right? You can't be thinking about, all right, what's coming up in the next piece, what's coming up in the next bar, what's the next point I have to come in while you're singing. You have to be able to do both. You have to be able to do both well. You learn to watch for cues, and most importantly, you learn how to achieve collective results. When you're part of an ensemble, when you're part of a team, it's not about me, Jamie, second alto, making my voice heard above everybody else in my section. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't sound right. It's dissonant. It just doesn't sound like an even experience, right? It's about the collective results of that ensemble, the collective results of your security or your compliance department, and how it impacts the business. Remember, both in code and in policy, we tend to inscribe our own values and experiences. If you build a team that is representative of the users and the expanded markets you want to serve, they will anticipate and solve for the problems those users and organizations face as well. This benefits both your organization and your product. If everyone attended the same CS or IA program, computer science or information assurance, they learn to solve the problems the same way. Just because somebody is from a different socioeconomic background or chose to attend an HBCU for cultural or legacy reasons, it doesn't mean that they're any less capable. It's just that they took a different path. When you're building your team, focus on those analogous experiences. Look for experiences and demonstrations where people hustled harder. Now, I may be biased because Duo is based in Ann Arbor, and for those that may be familiar with the Detroit area, Detroit hustles harder, right? It's true. But I may be a little bit biased there. But when you're thinking about those analogous experiences, take, for example, someone who has served in the military, and they have the potential to pick up organizational incident response if they've never done it before. Why? Because they know how to execute against policies and consistent procedures. That's an analogous experience that you can't teach It's something that they bring with them to the table to add to cultural contribution and team contribution. You need to be open to hiring both generalists and subject matter experts and invest in growing your generalists into subject matter experts with organizational context. A post-it that I've kept in my wallet, and I could pull it out here to prove it, it's something that I've had for years, and I consider one of my personal tenets as a hiring manager, is getting the team right is the necessary precursor for getting the ideas right. And if that sounds familiar to anyone, it's from Creativity Inc., which is a book about Pixar. I highly suggest giving it a read if that quote resonated with you. But the most important thing that you can do as a hiring manager on a security or a compliance team, or any team for that matter, is hiring well and making sure that you're inclusive and diverse in that process. And by diverse, I don't mean, hey, let's check the box, let's have this person represented. It's making sure that you have a team that's representative of the community that you're trying to serve. Language matters. Why does it matter? Well, information security frameworks, auditors, contracts, all use specific words that have specific meanings. How many people in here work in a legal team? Just one. Do you mind if I put you on the spot for a minute? Sure. Are there specific terms that you're used to dealing with in a specific definition that other people in your organization completely misinterpret?
Yes.
Do you have an example of one of those words?
Just fought with one of my supply chain folks on what best efforts means.
For everybody in this room, best efforts are widely different. Material is one that we hear a lot that people are like, what does that mean? But there's a lot of, what we have to realize is that we are tailoring our language to the different audiences that we have, right? So a good compliance team should be able to act as an interpreter, a translator, a facilitator, because they serve multiple audiences. They have multiple customers internally and externally. Being able to translate from a framework or a guidance document or a contractual requirement or a policy into the language of your audience is key. When you use the language of your audience, whether it's an engineering or a legal team, you show that you've taken the time to understand what they do, how they impact the business, and a general understanding of the technology and their workflows. And you'd think, well, why do I need to know their workflows? I could tell you right now, if you aren't thinking about their workflows, they're not going to be thinking about your policies. Additionally, when you have practical knowledge of technical controls for a compliance team, a pure compliance team, at least the knowledge of the impact of those controls within your environment, be it a corporate environment or a production environment, you're building trust and respect with those teams. If you don't know how something works or why it is there, ask. And the teams really appreciate it as a compliance person when you come to them and say, hey, I know you're the subject matter expert. I'm not coming to you because I doubt your implementation. I just want to get a greater understanding, so I'm representing our implementations, our controls well to the auditors. The practical knowledge of technical controls and their impact to the organization will help inform your policies and enable you to provide informed guidance to the teams as they develop and improve their process documents. It allows you to address the spirit of the requirements and not be overly prescriptive in policy documents, and almost more importantly, be in alignment with the culture of an organization. So, y'all may be asking me, why does culture matter while drafting a policy? If you aren't considering company culture while drafting a policy, you can easily create a policy misaligned with the maturity level of your company. And although you can get employees to acknowledge it and meet that requirement that's required of PCI, SOC 2, all these other frameworks that are out there, they will not read it or return to it, ever. I've talked to people in different roles and at different companies, whether I've worked there or I was working in an advisory capacity, where I've talked about the information security policy or specific section around access control or the business continuity disaster recovery plan. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, you acknowledge that. You acknowledge it annually. You've at least had to have read it at least once, whether it was on hire or last year. No, I just check the box. I just say yes. I'm like, okay, well, that's not working. The other problem, besides them ignoring it, are employees that will actively circumvent it. And they're not actively, most employees do not actively circumvent your policies and procedures because they're malicious. Most. They will circumvent your policies and procedures because they're trying to get their job done. If you're writing good policies and procedures, and by good I mean sustainable and flexible, you will see others within the ecosystem be inspired by your policies through either reuse of your core principles or even the exact language. This happens a lot. When they're revising or drafting their own policies. And you'll see them inform standards or best practices throughout the ecosystem. So one of the other things to think about, being empathetic. We've talked about empathy, simplicity, integrity. We just talked about simplicity, about how we think about these policies. Being empathetic, what does that mean in this context? This is what you owe your stakeholders, especially those who will be implementing the controls. Remember, you're not designing controls or policies for robots. You're not designing controls and policies that are in place to protect you from robots. Yes, I know technically there are bots that do things, but those bots are written by human beings that are playing off of the behaviors and the vulnerabilities of human beings. So at the end of the day, we have to be empathetic. We need to acknowledge the concerns of our stakeholders whenever we're trying to write policies or procedures, both from a compliance perspective or a security perspective. We need to understand the concerns. We need to provide contextual framing. Why are we doing this? Not just because I said so. I mean, it'd be nice if I could say that and wield that power, but it's not effective. We need to discuss the spirit and the letter of the requirement and what is the difference between the two. Because if you have an auditor that comes in that is extremely prescriptive and they are not technology agnostic, that is not the auditor for you. And the same thing should be how you interpret that framework of like, okay, what is the spirit? What are we trying to achieve? What problem are we trying to solve? And then we need to provide space to brainstorm potential controls. Those stakeholders in the organization that you need to implement these controls, to come up with policies and procedures, they're not going to want to do this work if it's dictated to them. They're more likely to do this work and maintain this and write all the documentation that's going to be required as part of a growing, evolving company that has these compliance or security requirements if they're bought in. And one of the ways that you get buy-in is that you give them the space and that you rely on their expertise and defer to their expertise to brainstorm those potential controls and work together to assess the plausibility and the feasibility of those controls. Is this all making sense so far? Another important thing to think about is the concept of whoa and not no. I like to say that both my security and compliance teams within my security operations wing of our security department are the teams of whoa, not W-O-E. Somebody had pointed out to me, they're like, which whoa do you mean? No. Slowing down, not pain, right? Compliance needs to be, and security as well, they need to be business enablers, not just rule enforcers, right? We have to understand the business goals, how compliance can assist in ensuring the success of those goals, how security can assist in ensuring the success of those goals. You have to work with the stakeholder teams to teach them how to build and empower them to leverage lightweight privacy and business impact assessments. Anybody go through GDPR recently? Anybody familiar with that? Anybody recently have to implement privacy impact assessments? Yeah. It's hard. It's hard, especially with teams that haven't been thinking about it that perspective because it hasn't been their responsibility. It's not saying that they're not doing the right thing. It's just not their charge. You've got to be able to put that into the process in a way that makes sense with their workflow, especially within like the product requirement document development process. Once you put it into that workflow earlier in the process, you're going to get a lot less pushback than you do putting it at the end after things are built. You want to provide that incentive of something simple and less impacting early, instead of making significant changes after a legal review, or worse, after an audit, especially one that has potentially public results. So, we were talking earlier about what problems we were trying to solve. Now, thinking back on how you described essentially the mission of your team, the purpose, what problems you solve, go back to each other, same people that you were speaking with, and describe it in a way that is empathetic, simplified, and executes with integrity. So go ahead and come together. talk for the next 2 minutes. And ultimately, when we're talking about integrity here, it's where you not only have the best interest of your organization, but also the best interest of your customer, be it internal or external. It sounds like you all have been having some pretty engaging conversations that I hope that you will continue after the rest of the session. No, this is good. I'm glad that there's been a lot of conversation. This is a very good thing. We want to continue to have these conversations about these different types of approaches. So what are some of the challenges of a multidisciplinary team or a hybrid team with a human-centric approach? Well, multidisciplinary and hybrid teams tend to fall into a hero trap. And just because we can implement or execute controls doesn't mean that we should. So it is really valuable to have that information or the previous experience of administering that server cluster or understanding how to set up IAM and how it should be and what those password policies, how to implement those types of things. But you shouldn't, not as a security or a privacy team or a compliance team. You really want to make sure that you're enabling those teams that are responsible for maintaining and executing. You want to make sure that they're doing that work. It's really easy to wear too many hats. When you start to wear too many hats, you're no longer effective. You're not spending enough time on that focus. Because of that, there can be some situations where people will say, well, you can do more with less because you're capable of doing more. It's true, yes, technically. That's both a benefit and a challenge. But a multidisciplinary team adds value and it impacts the business and it increases transparency and it reduces costly miscommunication because they're able to translate and facilitate. You can justify the cost of tools, automation, and additional headcount to free up your multidisciplinary staff to think bigger and provide more impact and contribute to strategy. You want to make sure that they're able to get the perspective that they need within the organization and not just focused on execution. Also, one of the challenges that a multidisciplinary compliance team may have that's a little bit different than a multidisciplinary security team is combating the negative stereotypes and experiences. So how many people have worked in a large organization where when they've heard the phrase compliance, they cringed because they knew that the person they were dealing with was not technical? That is a really big negative stereotype that compliance teams have to get around. Just because somebody is not technical does not mean that they're not capable. But also, a multidisciplinary compliance team doesn't mean that they've never done that work before. They're extending that understanding to you. It's helpful for you to extend that understanding to them. Another negative stereotype or experience that you may hear about is, oh, well, you didn't go to that elite CS school. Or you don't have a degree in blah. You have a degree in art, or you have a degree, you're a music major. This is why I talk about being a music major. I was a music major 17 years ago. Over the past 17 years, I have not been doing music work. I mean, I sing karaoke, that doesn't count. Maybe from a cultural perspective, right? It builds trust through culture and karaoke at work. But outside of that, remember, just because that was your base, your educational base, does not mean that that is all you are. You bring a lot of those lessons learned with you, but it's an accomplishment that you've had for personal reasons. Also, and I may be a bit biased here, it doesn't matter where or whether you did go to or finish going to a college or a university. It does show early on in your career that you're able to accomplish something. But if you can show that hustle, it doesn't matter that you've completed that university. There's lots of people in the information security space that haven't completed their degrees, but they're able to create and have impact within their organization. So remember, let's not let those negative stereotypes of a multidisciplinary background bias who we're hiring and their ability to contribute to the success and impact of your organization. So one other thing that we need to think about as we close is if we first have to bust the silos and only then we can address the problems, how do we know we'll have energy left for the real work? That's a hard question. One of the ways that we do that is we're actively not creating those silos. Where we see silos, we bust them. And we work to build those alliances with other teams and create that culture, that infectious culture of let's not have those silos there in the first place, so that we're delegating or we're spreading the load so that our teams do have the energy left for doing the real work and that we're inspiring each other to spread that work out. So as you're building and involving your security and compliance teams, consider the benefits of a multidisciplinary approach and incorporating empathy, integrity, and simplicity into your program. Any questions? Any comments? It's okay.
Hi, thanks
Hi.
for leading this class.
No problem.
When you say incorporating integrity and just all of that,
Yeah.
is that like in a policy or in the job description, or how do you really make sure that stands out?
Sure. So all of the above, you can do that. Is it specifically integrity or all three, empathy, integrity, and simplicity?
All three.
Mainly it's, as we discussed today, a lot of it is in the policy and the workings of the team. And so it would be, for a compliance team, for example, it's being empathetic to the needs of your stakeholders when you're drafting policies so that they're flexible, so that they can be incorporated into the workflows of the different teams that you impact. When you're, again, same thing with simplicity, making sure that you're making these simple, making sure that you are doing things that don't lead to circumvention, don't put unnecessary work into these documents, into these policies and procedures. And from an integrity perspective, as we're thinking about this from a security team, we're not just checking the box, right? We're making decisions about controls. We're making decisions about policies or procedures that impact not just the growth and evolution of a company and protects users' data, for those of you that have end user data, and you very well may. You want to be making sure that you're making the right choices for the right reasons, and that you're not just selecting security controls because you're checking the box. It's because you want to be practical. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Sure.
One thing we were talking about in our group is we started doing SOC 2 Type 2 a year and a half ago.
Mhm.
It was way more about mapping things that we already did.
Mhm.
If we didn't do them 100% consistently
Mhm.
to controls. It can be an opportunity to take what you're doing and do it more consistently maybe than you were in the past. But if you invent brand new things that people have to do or brand new systems that people have to use, it's not gonna happen.
It's not going to happen on day one, right? And it's going to be very difficult for you to have that commitment without having that drive from the top down as an initiative, but also from the bottom up to be able to move it forward. To the point about SOC 2 and compliance, I would rather see a company meet their controls and meet their obligations and think about how they're evolving their security program, their information security program and their controls, but they were consistently performing everything at a 7 out of 10, 10 being the best, right? Every single thing across the board, you know they're doing it at a 7 and it's consistent. Then they do some controls out of 2 and some out of 10 and some out of 4. Because consistency is one of the places where you will be compromised. If you're not consistent, if you're not, hey, how are we dealing with those logs? How are we doing? How are we dealing with access control? How are we dealing with change management? How are we dealing with pretty much anything that is a control family within an organization? If you're not doing that consistently, you're opening up a hole into your organization. So don't forget, like, consistency is key. You can always strive and iterate. You're not going to get it right on the first try, and that's okay. That's why you continue to have auditors come in and not only audit you to ensure that you're practicing what you preach, but also providing you with those recommendations in order to improve. Having that relationship with your auditor or your assessor, depending on what framework you're using, is really important. Don't just pick one because you're like, oh, hey, that's a big name. Or I know that's an auditor that's worked for our competitor. mean, those are helpful data points in evaluating them, but think of it almost like a job interview of sorts. You're not just assessing the firm that you're going with, but all the way down to the individual assessor or auditor you'll be working with, looking at their CVs, looking at their resumes, making sure that they have a very similar philosophy when it comes to alternative compensating or mitigating controls, essentially alternatives to what's written in that particular framework, and making sure that you're in alignment and that they have the technical understanding. It makes no sense to be working with an auditor who is, very, very proficient in a Windows environment and you don't have any Windows systems. Or somebody who's only worked, and now they may have 20 years of experience working on on-prem banking solutions, but they've never dealt with anything in AWS. That's not going to be helpful for you, and it's really going to frustrate those stakeholders, your technical stakeholders, when they're in the interviews with that auditor. So the relationship with the auditor is absolutely key. Any other questions or concerns? Comments? Well, thank you very much for joining us today. If you're interested in hearing more about any of the topics that I covered today, or how maturing your information security program is like running an ultramarathon, or how Alexander Hamilton's Reynolds pamphlet is an example of how not to respond to an incident, please let me know. Thank you very much.